NycosRPG. I'm Jonathan Albin, your host, and tonight on Game Master's Guide we're going to be looking at the concept of how we can take our games to war. Yes, most role-playing games are set up in a situation where there is a small skirmish group who is attempting to effect changes in some nation, in some place in the world. And today we're going to be looking at the possibilities of upscaling or downscaling your game in order to add specific nuance and flavor to the adventure and to also bring out the permanency and the destructive nature of warfare. Before we do that, make sure that you go down below and like, subscribe, click all the buttons so that the algorithm knows that you're part of our audience, and let's get going.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, or strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Alrighty, so when we talk about taking our roleplay situation into a war, we're actually discussing, wow, why am I having a fuzzy moment here? Ooh, don't know. But the idea here is that you are wanting to engage your players in perhaps an event that is of a greater scale than they might normally be involved with. Obviously, you can simply narratively do so just by carrying the forward details of the conflicts that the players aren't involved with, and that will suffice in many cases. But what I'm portending is that there is a possibility for you to bring your characters into the game session in a different light, for allowing them to become more heroic and the outcomes of their actions to be both more expansive and more inclusive than they might be otherwise. We're going to be looking tonight at 10 particular ways to do just that. So the first thing we have to do is determine the scale of the adventure that we want to place and present the players in front of. Think in terms of historical warfare and the concepts of the small group dynamics versus the larger. If you look at, for example, the Battle of Thermopylae, wherein allegedly 300 Spartans changed the course of a war. If you take that even to a smaller microcosm and say that your 6 players are going to represent the Spartans, how do we effect the change that placed upon the entire battle? How do we represent that in ways to show the players engaging with the much larger scale? And one of the ways to do that is to establish the very scale from the beginning, allowing the players to understand the dynamics and also to recognize their place in the story. For example, if you are playing with a group of characters that by Dungeons & Dragons mechanisms are between 5th and 9th level, that level of competency among your players should put them in good stead with fighting against entire squads of enemies, and therefore the success or failure of the conflict should sway larger groups of engagements. And we're going to be talking about how that is accomplished, but fundamentally you need to establish what that dynamical scale is, whether it's 1 to 10, 1 to 20, or whatever, so that the actions of the players will be impacting the much larger groups that might otherwise be present. The second thing we need to do is also determine the objective of this conflict. If you are playing through for example, a war, historically you'd be looking at an engagement that could last anywhere between 3 months to 6.5 or even 100 years, as in the 100 Years' War. And so you have to kind of give a parameter for what is going to resolve the war conflict, the actual engagement, so that the players have an idea of how long you'll be playing in that mechanic. There are some players who will really appreciate it, and other players will be totally not cool, so to speak, with war fighting for very long. And so determine what those parameters are early on in the conflict. Now, of course, in a campaign setting, having a session 0 that does include the possibility of this kind of an engagement provides the players with the agency to decide how much of what they're doing is part of this and how much of this is going to be on your shoulders as a game master. And quite frankly, if your group is not engaging with this, of course, you have to look at your other options. But make sure that the players are very clear what the objectives are, how long the conflict might go on, and allow the players the agency to determine how much they want to be involved in that. This also means that you have to clarify and redefine specifically what an enemy is. Is the enemy a philosophy, a position, a stance, or are there actual villains that can be eliminated to prevent or curtail the conflict? By understanding who the players are engaging with and what their purpose is, they can actually determine whether or not the large-scale conflict is what they want to play, or if that is just something that they are going to be aware of as they pursue their more specific objective points. So, if we assume that we are in a position where the players have agreed to this engagement and we're built out the scale, now we need to create unit profiles. And these can be done as dynamically and as quickly as putting together a persona sheet, a character sheet, if you will, for whatever game mechanics you're wanting to. Ascribe the numeric values equal to the mean of whatever their particular skills should be. So if it's a unit of clergy or a unit of rangers, build basically a persona sheet wherein you're going to replace the number of hit points with the number of units within the force and adjudicate those values accordingly. So, for example, if it's a squad of 20 units, then each unit represents an individual point, and each conflict success by your players is going to eliminate that said number of rangers. Now, it doesn't mean they're eliminated. It means they are taken from usability in the conflict, or therefore it reduces the effectiveness of that unit. Building these unit profiles, therefore, allow you to follow the action from scene to scene by which actors you put into that scene. So if it is a conflict with a group of rangers and for example, peasant brigade, then the peasant brigade's values would be considerably different. And so each roll of the dice will change the dynamic of the conflict. And in addition to changing their profiles, you'll also need to change their saving throws and everything to represent the mean. Again, understanding that a player persona is going to be considerably more stalwart and dependable, and not have to worry about the falling apart. And therefore, literally, the players will be dealing with their actual hit points, whereas the villains will be representing each of their hit points by an individual, and therefore you can operate the scaling appropriately. What this does, therefore, is it lets a individual from your player group to represent better his ability to affect the morale outcome of the collective. Also, you need to be able to and be aware of the heroics that a player character is going to be wanting to do within the conflict here. The chance for an individual to stand against 30 individuals or hold a doorway or whatever for a certain number of turns can itself become the heroic that the players have always been seeking for, and it's a way for you as the game master to build in a level of heroism that the players might be striding for but not knowing how to accomplish. And by giving them the opportunity, then you can make the actions fit what they're looking for, and ascribing a greater feel to the player's interaction within the scene. This also means that a heroic, when you speak of heroism, you can also speak of the dedication of a villain, so that even if a villain is able to, as a portion of a unit, accomplish something, give that its proper due so that the players actually feel the validity of that particular villain unit in terms of the respect that they might earn within the game. It also means that you need to fundamentally change from your usual role-playing game master voice to a director voice, because now you're talking about operating at a larger scale. You don't have time, for example, in a larger scale like that, to have the conversation between 3 NPCs at a local bar. Instead, you're dealing with what's going to happen when the scene changes in the morning with the ebb and flow of the battle. And by having the ability to change to this director voice, then you can actually give an authority to the actions in a way that it becomes much more cinematic for your players to engage with, because they recognize that you are now expressing things on that larger scale. It also means that you need to be very aware of the tempo of your sessions and make sure that you're snapping off actions appropriately with the amount of time. If you are going to have an adventure that is including the smaller scale, for example, discussion between 2 or 3 NPCs, then you need to greatly slow the adventure in terms of that passage of time, because it's such a small portion of the whole, and then immediately ramp back up to full speed once you move back to the larger conflict resolution. That is to say, the role play of that three-player session might be a half an hour, but then that would be compared to, say, a day and a half within the rest of your role play session, because you're rapidly moving through the actions at that larger scale number, so that you've got more people to move through a space, and therefore it has to happen at an equitable rate. Now, this also means that you need to keep giving the players updates on what's going on, not only in their own conflict, but in the ones up and down the combat line, so that the players will be able to grasp the gravity of their engagement. So, for example, if they are tasked with keeping a certain section of the line safe, then you need to be able to show the ebb and flow of the battles on either side as those move, and how they moderate and change the way the game state occurs. You need to report that back to the players in a rapid fashion. Generally, this will mean utilizing the concept of the generic runner from one unit to another, carrying that information, whether it be a heroic cavalryman or a enterprising scout. But the idea of carrying this information back to the group in a fashion that lets them make the decisions in rapid form, this allows the players, for example, to spread out and be dealing with multiple units instead of trying to resolve everything as individuals. This also gives way to you as a game master kind of reading the tea leaves in terms of how conflicts are going. If you've set up equitable conflict values across the group, then the outcomes of each engagement should be moderatable, not necessarily that you're going to prevent or eliminate or even curtail the actions of the players in terms of their action, but what you're doing instead is you're being able to see when the trends are such that a success is warranted in one area of the field, simply because the fortuitousness of the dice rolls have granted it to be seen in going that direction. And then in places where you no longer need dice rolls, go ahead and allow those situations to resolve within the narrative, so that the players' actions can be seen as affecting and adjusting the overall conflict. And if a player's resolute stance is to hold the ground, then by all means let them make that attempt, recognizing that the level of heroism is having to go up, and the risk to the player of capture or destruction is also inclusive in that. And of course, the end of this is going to be the aftermath. When you have operated a scale that is the 1 to 10 ratio, then when the battle is over and you go back and reconcile how many units have been broken, so to speak, how many individuals have been cut from their commands, what happens? How do they resolve that? How do they reform? How do you fix the conflicts that you've allowed to occur? And whether you do this over a longer term and feed the information back as you personally internalize the results, or if you instead utilize a die rolling mechanism like NycosRPG to provide that information back to the players, the idea is that whatever you come up with at the end should be promoting and advancing the player's role in that conflict, and also the level of the scale and what it means to have 20 individuals die compared to maybe only 3 or 4 were eliminated, but the rest were shaken or were never going to be the same again because they had never seen conflict. There's so many different ways to write these stories. It's rather difficult here in the snippet, but the idea here is that you need to be able to wrap up the conflict in this scale before you slide back down into 1-to-1 scale, so that those that are around that experienced it can become the colorization, if you will, of the backdrop for the adventure going forward. Of course, this idea of experimenting in scale is really a matter of what you as a game master are trying to do. By utilizing these tools, you're going to give your players a larger perspective on what's going on in a conflict, and at the same time show how greatly these conflicts can affect your overall. I'm doing well, thank you, Gift of Gabby, so nice to see you. The issue, therefore, is that when you are game mastering the larger scale conflict, you are influencing a much larger audience for your players to have experienced. And so their movement within the campaign now can be altered by that, because if the unit is from a local city, when they go to visit that city, then the way they reacted with that group can now be carried forward. So you're building out the theme of your adventure in ways that are more natural and more identifiable in terms of what the players want from the game and what the players do to change the environment. So, of course, it leaves in the end the question of how do you handle conflicts at the larger scale in your tables. I would love to hear some comments. Leave me some words of encouragement and things that you do within your game. Love to have a great conversation about what we might do in the future. As you may know, NycosRPG is here roughly 5 days a week, so I will have another episode within the next 24 hours, and I hope to see you then. Make sure you like, subscribe, and if you don't appreciate what's going on in this channel, please leave me a message. Let me know what I can do to change it. I'd love to embrace all people who play all games everywhere, and I'd love to be a part of what's going on at your table as well. I'm Jonathan Albin. This has been NycosRPG. Hope to see you next time. Go play.